Great. No, thank you so much, Bjørn, and thank you for the introduction. Great pleasure to join you and these fantastic webinars. I'll give a little bit of an introduction to myself. I've been a sailor pretty much my whole life. Most of the time I spent racing. I did some Olympic Games, and I did the Whitbread or the Volvo Ocean Race 4 times, 3 as a skipper and 1 as a crew. Or 2 as a skipper, sorry, and 2 as a crew, and then done some cruising after I stopped racing, and that's really what it's about today. And then today I'm the CEO of Navico, a company that runs brands like B&G, Simrad, and Lowrance and CMAP. However, I'm not going to talk about the products I manage today. I'm not going to talk about the business. I'm really invited here by Grand Large to talk about the cruising experience, and probably because I used to own one of their catamarans, and I took my kind of crazy racing attitude when it comes to details and planning and preparations into the cruising, which was a new experience for me. So the idea today is for me to share what I experienced from my pretty newly endeavors into the cruising world with my family, and some learnings I really found. I really tried to dig deep into understanding how cruising sailors prepare, how they work with technology, and how that could potentially help expanding that experience and improving that experience. So I'm kind of going to try to share my best practice experiences and learnings from the time I've been actively blue water cruising since I stopped racing. And I had some interesting findings, and something I also brought from my racing world that I thought really improved the cruising experience. So I thought I should just start with this slide. And let me also say that if you have any questions for me, feel free to use the chat on the right side. I will try to answer your questions along the road, and also at the end, after about 40 minutes, going through a few slides and a few experiences. It's a lot to talk about when you can talk about blue water cruising and digital experience and technology. But I will just start with why I sail, and which is quite important to me when you try to expand and improve on the experience, is that for me there is 2 big reasons. One is that I find it extremely fascinating that we have this blue planet that very few people remember when they live on land, that the majority is actually sailable waters that you can experience with a boat, which is something completely unique, and it's also the most disconnected way in the world. We talk about connectivity a lot today and how to bring everything connected, but a lot of sailors, I think, go sailing because it also disconnects them with the rest of the world, and you can focus in peace and harmony on the boat. And the second reason for me, apart from being outdoor in nature, is to be with other people. I really enjoy sailing with others. I've done a little bit of short-handed sailing, but I really prefer sailing with other people, mostly because it's such a good way of being together with others. I will come back to that later, but this is my little family. When we started blue water cruising back in 2017, we bought an Outremer 5X and went on to a fantastic journey in the Atlantic from the north of Norway down to the Mediterranean, and then we crossed the Atlantic and did the whole Caribbean and other things later. So I will come back to that. So 2 big reasons for me, being outdoor, being with other people, and that has to be sort of my goal with sailing. So click to the next. I come from a racing world, so I'm not going to talk about racing today, but I have some interesting reflections on something you learn really well in offshore racing that is sometimes also very useful for cruising, I think. So I even did some multi-hull racing a lot in France with a class that was called the Orma 60, and that kind of led me to thinking about Outremer. This is just a photo of some sailing I've done in the last 3 years. This is up in the west coast of Norway. It really pictures to me why cruising is such a fantastic thing with a sailboat, because you go places where no one else can go. If you have a catamaran like I had that has no draft, you can really anchor or dock in very shallow waters and places that is almost impossible to come to. And this little place here in one of the fjords in Norway is a place you just cannot get to with a car, and certainly not with a cruise ship. And it's just, yeah, it sums up, why we do this and why we can get to these fantastic places that no one else can get to. So I'm going to go through these 5 topics. I'm going to talk about the sort of the digital technology on board, how that it looks today, my experiences with that, and how I think it can end up in the future. I'll talk about a topic that's a big thing for me, which is like, you know, how fast we sail. I could also talk about how much we sail versus how much we motor. I will talk a bit about the weather. That is also kind of technology driven today. A bit about safety and a bit about being in the same boat. And then I'm sure I will also answer some questions. So the digital journey was for me very interesting. When you race offshore, obviously the instruments you have on the boat and the technology you have is extremely important. Not necessarily because it tells you all the time what to do, but it gives you a very accurate picture of what's happening around the boat. So you know exactly how much is blowing. You know exactly how that wind is changing, and you can make very, very good decisions all the time about sailing faster by going higher or lower or having the right sails up. And what I discovered was when I started this journey with my family, I went quite detailed into the job and tried to really learn from other people. I had some very good friends of mine, Johan and Christine Salem, who had an Outremer 5X, which was kind of the reason why we ended up with that boat. That boat was called Moana, and I spoke to a lot of people who did a lot of blue water cruising about their boats, their experiences, and I also spoke to them about electronics and how they used electronics. And I discovered that a lot of people didn't really use electronics very actively. They kind of used it for some, but not really very actively in optimizing how they sailed the boat or how they planned the trip. So I ended up interviewing a lot of people, and I did that because at that time I was on the board of Navico, and I wanted to understand, you know, how a cruising sailor is using marine electronics. So I made a big report. I'm not going to go through that report today of a lot of pages that I made for Navico, where I interviewed 84 families around the world about how they use electronics on boats when they're cruising, which was extremely interesting because I found that very few actually had them working properly. And that was a big discovery for me. And one of the biggest things I realized was that people were sometimes upset because the numbers were not feeling the same way yesterday as they did today, or the boat was not steering accurately. And some of it has to do with how you set electronics up. But the most important thing is to remember when you sail offshore is that no day is the same. And many people forget that the wind is never the same in a single day. And the reason it's different is because wind is a result of many things. It's a result of friction on the surface. So if you have high friction, you have less wind coming down to the surface. Most of the wind we talk about in weather forecast is for a measure at 10 meters above surface. That's the typical wind forecast we get in the weather forecast. That's typically 10-meter forecast. And when you measure the wind further down to the surface, you see much less wind. And when you measure it higher up, you see more wind. And that's due to the friction. But the friction is actually different every day. And many people are not aware of that. And what impacts the friction on the water is the waves, but it's also the temperature. So if the temperature difference is very big between water and air, the friction gets very high. And then there is less wind coming down to the surface. If the temperature is almost the same in the air and the water, there's less friction, and then the wind gets further down. And then you have the density of the air, which has with the humidity and many other things, how that impacts the wind as well. So some places the wind is stronger than other places. So density, temperature, friction, all these things has an impact on the wind, which means that what was 20 knots yesterday in the top of the mast is not necessarily the same as 20 knots in the top of the mast the day after. Which means when you look at your numbers, when you calibrate your numbers on the boat and all these things, you have to expect and accept that every day is a little bit different and it needs a little bit of manual interference. And I can tell you that the professional sailors, they do this every single day, several times. They tune the wind up and down because it is a little bit different. And I think it's if I take you to the next slide, the first thing for me was to discover where people have their electronics in the boat. And you know, when you build a racing boat, you know exactly pretty much the 4 or 5 positions you're going to be most in the boat. And then you place the electronics perfectly so you can both look where you want to look, but also see what you want to see at the same time. The classical example is that when you are steering a boat, you are really always wanting to look straight ahead. You want to look straight ahead for multiple reasons. First of all, you can see your head sail, so you can see the telltales, you can see that you are sailing, well optimal to the wind angle, but you also want to see what's in the water in front of you. You want to see if there's any debris or any waste or any things that you don't want to crash with in the water. So you're kind of looking straight ahead. You can't really see through the sails, but you want to see just the weather of the headstay and then maybe 45-degree angle up to weather. And that's your viewing angle typically when you are sailing the boat. Not always. Sometimes you can be inside, sometimes you can be in the cockpit. And then you want to have the important instruments and the important data as close as possible to your viewing angle. I discovered that catamarans is interesting because they were not really designed for electronics to start with. So you kind of have to add some pods here and there to make it work. But I went through a big process on my boat to really apply my racing brain on how I would be cruising. And I also discovered that, most of the time on the boat, you have to prepare to be completely alone. Even though when you sail with your wife or your children or your friends or your family, they may be with you one day, the next day they may not be with you, or another time they may be asleep. And in a cruising boat, you pretty much have to always be ready to maneuver the boat alone. So I kind of went through a process to set up how would I place the electronics in the boat if I was alone. And I always wanted to have the optimal angle. And I played with all the different scenarios. I went through a very deep process. It's quite fun to do. And you kind of quite often discover that what comes from the factory is maybe not the right place to put the electronics, because it's in a place where you look down next to you or something. So you don't really have the information really available. And you see that in automotive, in cars. Now they're coming instruments, as pop-up screens inside the screen in front of you. So you can actually your eyes are just popping down 10 degrees to see the speed of the car and to see, for example, the speed limit where you're driving. You don't have to move your eyes very far. So, and I think that has value for a cruising sailor as much as it has for a racing sailor. It's just that the racing sailor are more focused on it and they spend more time on these things. But it was a big learning for me that, actually location of electronics was something that a lot of cruising people I met, they hadn't even thought about. And when they came to my boat and they say, well, wow, this is interesting. I can actually look at it while I'm sailing without having to do more than moving my head a little bit. And the same applies to be inside the boat. I'm going to click forward. So yeah, a couple of comments here. I think electronics, why electronics can help you on cruising, it can help you to sail faster. And some people are going to say, you're crazy. Why do you need to sail faster? And I will come back to why I think speed is also interesting when you cruise. But electronics really help you to sail the boat the right angles. It helps you to sail safer when you have the good electronics because it really you make sure that you can see trends of wind. You can understand that you don't have sails up more sails up than you should have. You can make sure that you have the right consistent angles on waves. I would say the autopilot was also a big discovery for me, that many did not have the autopilot well set up. I met people in the Caribbean who didn't know that you can get the pilot to steer the boat straight. It sounds a bit ridiculous, but it needs a bit of work in an autopilot to set it up properly. And a sailing autopilot is a complex thing because it takes input from wind, it takes input from rudder, and it has different ways of compensating and steering the boat. But it is possible to set up a pilot to sail a boat perfectly straight today and to sail it really well in all conditions and to make it tack and maneuver the boat. So when you are alone, you can do that well. So doing that well, I said about seeing what you need, where you need it. I think it's also important. I focused a lot on being able to sail the boat also from inside the boat. I have small children with me, and sometimes I was alone with the small children and they didn't want to be in the cockpit, or I couldn't have them in the cockpit because it's too windy. Then I wanted to be inside with them. And I still wanted to be able to see what I needed to see so I could actually change course. Now, I always wanted to be able to steer the boat from the inside. Today, that is super easy to do with electronics. You can have a little wheel, a turning wheel that you connect to your plotter, and you can actually steer the boat. Not only adjust the pilot and moving the course up and down, but actually actively steer the boat directly. If you have to do a maneuver, change course for something in the water or something happens. Yes, and I think that covers a little bit on the electronics. I don't want to speak about electronics, but in detail, but what I can say is that I was asked about the future of digital sailing, and someone asked me that I can talk a bit about that. You will see that there's a lot of new trends now about new things coming to boating. Typically, one thing that happens is that screens get bigger, and that is a natural thing. It's possible today to make very good waterproof LCD screens that has reasonably low power consumption. And the beauty with having a bigger screen is a bit like rolling out your cartography on a big chart table like we did in the old days, instead of looking at the small map. And you get much more information on the same place. So you can see much more. You can see more nautical miles of charts in front of you, and with very good clarity. And I think that is a fantastic experience. It enables you to really plan much better. It enables to have a much better view around the boat. And we will see this coming more and more. And what's going to drive when it appears in cruising sailing is really a cost thing. It's like, when is it cost competitive? And you will see that in all the automotive industry now, the new cars, they have more screens, bigger screens. They have something called the super wide format, which is a very wide LCD screen, which is also very useful for boats. Boats tend to have spaces that are not completely square. For electronics, they typically have narrow, long ones or vertical ones. And then that's when what a super wide format LCD screen really comes into play. So bigger screens, that's really the trend. We know it's coming now. And it's screens that you typically can control both by touch, but always also by buttons. There was a movement in electronics to go all about touch and just have touch screens. I think the verdict is there now that, in particular sailors, we also want to have buttons. We also want to have something physically that we can hold on to when the boat is moving around and it's wet and it's spraying. We can't only rely on touch. Touch has some great benefits, but you need these controls, and that will develop a lot in the future. The other thing I have on the right side of the slide here is really about digital switching and control and remote control the boat and integrating everything together. So we're seeing more and more that the control panels are moving to the screen, and from the same screen, you can pretty much control the whole boat. And today we do super yachts, like huge boats, for this 120-foot boats, where everything in a super yacht is controlled from one screen. Which is quite a big shift from what we have seen in the past. That has a lot of benefits because you can also create redundancies, and you can have backups, and you can control it from many places in the boat. So you can control the same things from the nav station as you can control from the cockpit. You think maybe is the water pump running, and you can check it in the cockpit. You don't have to go somewhere to check it. You can have everything from all the places. So that is an interesting trend. There are some other bigger trends coming about autonomy. And this thing is about, what they call smart boats. Personally, I'm a little bit skeptical about the smart boat journey. I think that today we are starting to see cars being smarter and smarter. In the last 2-3 years, there are cars driving around on autopilots in the US. They're starting to come in Europe. And those pilots are obviously fairly smart because they have to react to everything that's happening in their surroundings, whether someone is crossing the street, or there's traffic jam, or there's change of speed limits, etc. They have to understand it, read it, interpret it, and make a decision for you. And I always say that boats are not cars. And in the car industry, there's kind of this drive to remove the driver from the steering wheel, and then there are even cars designed today that doesn't have a steering wheel, and the car is purely a sort of concept of transport. And I think that is an interesting one, because I think if you take the steering wheel away from a boat owner, that's one of the main reasons he owns the boat, is to steer the boat and enjoy this pleasure of being a skipper and a captain on your own ship, and master that ship is kind of one of the challenges you really go for. So I always tell people when there are people telling me that you should look at the automotive industry that's what's coming in boating. I always say that the big difference is that the majority of people who buy cars today, they buy them because they need transport. The majority of people who buy boats, pretty much everyone buy it because they love them, not because they need them. And that's a very, very big difference. So the boat is much closer to what I call the smart house. We have tried to make smart houses now for 30 years. And they're still pretty dumb today. And that is because there are so many components in a house, and there's so many components in a boat, and there are different suppliers, and the boat builders are fairly small in volume. They don't build thousands and thousands of boats. They build a few hundred at best. So there is an autonomy trend. I think this is what I have described on this slide, where I think the more realistic journey is that we are going to take the sensors we have on board. We are working on this today. We are going to combine that with all the data we have available. So we have available cartography, we have available sensors about the depth, we have available radar. We will have some new sensors on boats now that tells us how the distance to the dock, for example. And combining that data, we can help the sailors and the captains to make better decisions. I think we are still very far away from the boat that makes the decisions and actually docks the boat for you completely automatically. There are some auto docking technology out today, but you have to remember that docks are very different depending on where you dock. They can be everything from a low little floating pontoon to a steel construction that's super high. Then you have the waves, then you have the wind, then you have the current, then you have the drift of the boat. All of these variables are far more complex than a car that only has to park on a surface that is not moving. So we are seeing these trends, and obviously we are seeing the electrification trend, which I'm very excited about, that sailing can really help driving the sustainability, the journey in the world, and make a very big impact there. I'll shift a little bit of topic and talk about speed and why speed is your friend. So I obviously came from this crazy background where the only thing we think about is boat speed when we're out sailing. And I had this situation in my family, which I don't think is completely unique, that my wife was not super keen. I mean, she loved sailing. She kind of still likes it, but she doesn't like spending 3 weeks out in the ocean. And she rather gets quicker to the destination than later. And then I kind of went through a few sort of iterations. We rented some boats. We went cruising with friends on boats. And then I got into this Outremer 5X, which is a very fast catamaran. And I started to sort of optimize the boat, more because I thought it was fun, not because I wanted to go racing with it. But I just thought, I'd like to make sure that I sail this boat at the best possible performance I can get. So I made the boat light. I made sure I didn't have too many tanks. I didn't want to have air conditioning, all those things. And I got some really nice sails on it here. I have a Gennaker I bought from some of my friends in the IMOCA 60 world to make the boat perform really, really well. And then I met other people who had the same boat, but they didn't work so hard on it. But I discovered that I could do pretty much 2 to 3 knots more than them quite a lot of the time. But I like to say why I discovered, and my wife actually got into me in the end. In the beginning, she thought I was crazy because I was so focused on making this cruising boat have good performance all the time. But in the end, she really understood it. And she said to me, she was so happy because, first of all, there is something about speed and weather. And that's really worth noting, is that when your boat, if you make your boat go a little bit faster, you stay longer in the good weather. Weather systems are moving, and typically weather systems are moving faster than you sail in a cruising boat. So if you have the nice wind that you want to be in, which is typically a wind that is either from the side or behind, the faster you can stay with that weather system. That means the faster you sail, the longer you stay in the weather system. And to make the extreme on that is this new Ultime massive multi-hulls in France that race now around the world to do the Jules Verne record. They almost sail now the same speed as the low pressure systems in the Southern Ocean. Those systems move 30, 35 knots of speed, and they can keep 35 knots of speed today. So they basically can stay in one system pretty much across half the globe, from Cape to Good Hope, almost all the way to Cape Horn, which is because they can keep that speed, so they can stay perfectly in the weather system. As well, you need speed to avoid the bad weather. I used to start sailing many, many years ago in IOR boats that were quite slow. And pretty much the more it was blowing, the slower they were compared to the wind speed in a way. And in the end, you had these terrible situations where you could go nowhere. You're really stuck and a big storm is arriving and the only thing you can do is to ride the storm. When you have speed, you can maneuver much more and you can actually almost escape the bad weather or escape certainly in super fast boats you can. But even with the cruising boat, by optimizing the boat a bit, you can sail strategically away from bad weather much better. It also gives you a bigger window for when you can leave. If you have a boat that is slower, you have less options for when you can leave, because at some stage you need to leave. You can't wait, and speed opens up that window a lot, and your planning gets more accurate, and the boat gets more stable. So stability has also a speed component. Sailing a little bit faster is better, and your kids get a lot more happy when they get to the destination a little bit earlier. And I could probably use another word than speed is your friend. I could probably say also sail more. And I think in particular with catamarans, not necessarily Outremer, because I think all the Outremer people I met, they were pretty active sailors, but I met a lot of people in the Caribbean, in the Atlantic, on this side, in the Mediterranean, who didn't sail very much with their catamarans. And I sat down with one of them I became a good friend with, who had a pretty heavy catamaran. And I discovered that he had a very, very small head sail. So I found a secondhand called Zero Sail for him, rigged it up for him, and showed him how he could sail his catamaran in 4 knots of wind and actually do almost 60-70% of the speed he could do with an engine. But then he could also sail more and motor less and have much more experience. And I think I really managed to change the experience for him completely by understanding that you can make a cruising boat go really well in light wind, but you have to work on it a little bit. It's not necessarily what they set it up from. A bit about the weather. Weather is one of the reasons I sail. I think weather is a fascinating thing. Like you never get a super world expert on it. You have to learn all the time. It's changing all the time. No day is the same ever. It's never been one identical day on the planet. So weather predictions can never be 100%, although the weather models today are getting better and better. But they're changed, the weather change. I mean, that whole dynamic with the weather is one of the fascinating things with sailing and really, really important. And I think that's an area where I discovered as well that cruising, we have a lot to benefit from getting deep into weather, and technology has completely transformed weather in the last 10 years. The picture on the left here is pretty much what I used to look at, if I go back to the 90s, which is not so long time ago, 90s and even beginning of 2000, we looked at these traditional weather models drawn up on a chart. We still do today to some extent, and they come from pretty much the same data. It's just that the data is so much better today and so much more accurate, and the presentation of the data is completely transformed. On the right, there is just one example of a website I use very often when I'm just looking for short-term weather, which is windy.com. There are many, many others where anyone can just log in anywhere you want from your mobile phone and your computer, and you can get a fantastic presentation of weather, and you can scroll back forward in time. You can choose different weather models, whether you want the American model, the GFS model, or the European model. So today, technology has completely transformed how we can look at weather. So anyone has pretty much access to something you have to be a professional sailor to have in the old days, and you can see wave heights and all these things. But the big question is, what does it mean? How do you translate this to your sailing and your cruising? And there is some work to do. And one of the interesting parts I discovered was obviously I was looking at my polar diagram, the diagram that tells you what is the speed of this boat going to be at different wind angles and different wind speeds. I met up with the designer VPLP of our catamaran because I wanted to get the most accurate picture. And that is a little bit because I have this paranoia behavior from my racing world. But the principle you kind of have to start with is that no sailboat goes the same speed in all directions. There's no sailboat that has a circular polar diagram. Some boats have more circular, catamarans have less circular, and that means that they go much faster in some wind angles than in others. And where they go faster also changes with wind speed. And this is super important to know when you're cruising, because the classical thing I discovered, and I can tell you, I did this RC race from the Canaries to the Caribbean together with my friends on board our boat. It's a cruising regatta, but I spoke to a lot of the people who started, and I spoke to them afterwards and asked them how they were planning to route themselves across the Atlantic, etc. A lot of people talked about heading and course and waypoints, and I was really very focused around that, and not understanding that in reality, when you sail across the Atlantic, it's less important to point to the finish line pretty much all the time until you have half a day left to the Caribbean. That's when you can really start thinking about pointing at the finish line, when you are very, very close to St. Lucia and the finish there. And the reason is that if you change course and you go off course a few degrees and you go faster, normally it pays off. But that's a pure mathematical calculation. It's actually not a gut feeling. It's not something that guys just think it's cool to sail higher and then go a little faster or lower a little faster. It's pure mathematics. It's a very simple formula. I actually thought I show a little bit here. So I took a simple diagram here that shows you what we call a VMC, or some call it a VMG, but VMC calculation when you go offshore. And this means that when your finish line is more than a day away, so it's really far away, you don't really have to think about pointing directly to the finish line. If you can go a little bit faster pointing off. And on the first column here, you have the angle off course. So that means how much are you off course? So typically here, what I've circled in red, it means that if I'm sailing 20 degrees off course, so instead of pointing at my final waypoint, I'm pointing 20 degrees off that waypoint. And the boat is doing 4 knots before I did that. To compensate for the extra distance I sail, being 20 degrees off, I only have to do 4.3 knots. So imagine, I'm pointing straight to the finish line in the Caribbean. I've just left Tenerife. And then if I sail 20 degrees higher, I only have to go 0.3 knots faster if I did 4 knots before. And then I will be getting to Tenerife at the same time. And then you have to look at that calculation every day. So obviously you can't continue sailing 20 degrees of course the whole way across the Atlantic on the same heading, but you can continue to sail 20 degrees off your heading to the waypoint, because that heading will slowly change. But as long as you can compensate with speed increases, you will be faster. So when I spoke about sailing faster, it's not just about having higher boat speed, it's also about sailing faster to the finish line. And it's a typical misperception that offshore sailors always sail the shortest course. I can guarantee you that they never do. Offshore racing sailors never, ever sail the shortest course. They sail the fastest course. And the fastest course is most of the time significantly longer than the shortest, simply because you get so much more speed. And the trends with boats today is that boats have less and less circular polar diagrams. And that is simply that, boats are starting to have these kind of speed profiles like a catamaran, and that happens with monohulls as well, that they go really fast at certain angles. Has to do with stability, has to do with sail plan, has to do with many things. But it's really worth exploring this. And this diagram, by the way, is nothing for a specific boat. This is pure mathematics and pure physics. So you can copy, you will get probably a copy of this presentation, and you can tape it in your boat, and it applies to any boat in the world, however slow, however fast you go. So it has nothing to do with speed, but obviously how much faster you will go by changing your course is impacted on your polar diagram. But you can always test it. We do that when we race. We go the 4 knots, and then we say, okay, let's try to go 20 degrees off course. And then we see, do we now go 4.3? Yeah, we go 4.4. Wow, then it pays off. Let's stay there. And then you can play with that. And this way you get across the Atlantic much quicker. It's quite a simple thing, not really a digital thing, but it's worth knowing. Then on the weather, I really advise those who are thinking about it to learn about weather routing. Weather routing is a fantastic science. I just posted a couple of books here written by my old navigator, Jean-Yves Barnaud. Jean-Yves Barnaud is really the grandfather of weather routing in France. He's written many books, unfortunately, most of them in French. There's a couple in English. But there are many other sources. But learning about weather routing is fascinating. And basically, weather routing is how you know your profile of your boat, so how the boat sails, and how that boat sails through a weather model. You get the grid file that gives you a 10-day weather forecast, how the weather is going to evolve in every single little spot around the world. And then the computer will help you to sail the boat through that grid file for the next 10 days. And these data models are getting more and more and more accurate. When I started using weather models in 1992, 93 offshore, the weather models was really inaccurate after 2-3 days. Now you can really have much longer perspective on them, and the frequency, the accessibility of the data, how you can download it is much better. So learning about weather routing, if you have the time and you have the interest, I really recommend it. If you don't have the time, I really recommend using professional weather routers to advise you on your cruising when you go for really long trips. I have done it many times, blue water cruising, even though I regard myself as pretty good on weather routing. I did a big cruising trip to the Antarctica some years ago. I used Commander Weather in the US to help me to give me their their route planning for my trip. It's just that, you know, sitting in a boat in some locations, you don't have always the same information, and the price you pay is very, very low to get that advice. So for people who are a little bit concerned about weather and going sort of long distance, crossing oceans or crossing complicated areas, such in the south of South America, where you have really difficult weather conditions, you know, I really advise using professional weather routers. It's just simply an email. You pay a little bit of money, and they send you information on a regular basis over a period, and advise you when you should leave, advise you about the window and how the trip is going to be across. And they are normally extremely good at what they're doing, taking multiple sources. And then obviously you can also have weather routing on board yourself and learn how to do that. There are even today services. I've just listed up 3 services here that I've been quite familiar with, and I used quite a bit on my cruising. One is Squid, which is a French service. Squid and Predict Wind, they have this service that they can actually do routing of your boat. You don't have to actually do it yourself. So you can select your boat model. You can go online and you can select the trip you want to do. And then it will give you the different routes it sees in the weather model. So you don't have to do anything on your boat. You don't have to know the software. It's very user-friendly, but you need to be online on the internet to do it, obviously. So it's difficult to do this in the middle of the ocean, unless you have internet on the boat. Commander's Weather have fantastic weather services. They also have active routing, and then Predict Wind has the same as Squid. Predict Wind is also integrated into many of the chart plotters. In B&G, for example, we have that, so you can actually see the weather model in the chart plotter the whole way across, which is interesting technology. My last one of my last topics is really around safety. I used to run the Volvo Ocean Race for 8 years as a CEO of that event, so I've been a lot involved in safety management. This is for my race control. And safety is an interesting piece in cruising. In racing, we are extremely focused on it. This is from a picture I took in '94 when I was racing in the Southern Ocean of these icebergs. And I always say that, you know, when you see an iceberg and you know they are icebergs, it's the ultimate test of trust in your friends. And I call it the sleeping bag test. And the sleeping bag test, that's when you sleep in one of these boats that are going super fast, and you know that there's a lot of ice around you, and they can't see the ice if it's small enough. And then you think about who is driving this boat, and what is the attitude that this person is having in general. And the more humble that person is, the more you trust him or her, and the more confidence you have, and the more you enjoyed it. The less humble and the person is, the less you trust and the less you enjoy the trip. And I think the same is the same for cruising, at least for my wife and for my kids and my friends that we brought with us. I know that safety was one of the biggest things that impacted how much they enjoy the trip. So I thought I should just share a couple of things on safety. This is an example of what shouldn't happen, but this is actually from the last race I managed as a CEO of the World Ocean Race. One of the teams managed to sail, boat full of professional sailors, managed to sail a boat straight onto a reef in the middle of the Indian Ocean at the middle of the night, doing 25 knots. In some miraculous way, no one lost their life, and we activate the crisis plan. I typically say that, you know, when there is a crisis on the boat, you have to always remember from which perspective you see the crisis. And this is a funny cartoon, but it's kind of some seriousness behind it, that, you know, looking at the boat crisis from the outside is very different than seeing it from the actual boat. And I think that, you know, a lot of things can be said about that journey, but I'd just like to say that we made a 100-page report from that accident because we wanted to make sure that we could learn from it. If we needed to do something with our crew members, our technology, our race route, our cartography that was used, you know, how did we need to make any changes? But I can just tell you that the last sentence of that report, which was written by 4 independent auditors, all experts in sailing, Stan Honey, one of the world's best navigators, was one of them. And the conclusion was that it's better to have no idea than to be confidently wrong. Again, it's about being humble. And I just like to flag that, you know, we had a lot of friends. That was one of the reasons me and my wife went cruising. We wanted to invite all the friends we hadn't seen for years and share time with them on the boat. So many of them were not sailors. And I discovered very early how much it meant for them to feel very safe in an environment they were not feeling safe because they didn't have any ID really. So there's two hot tips. This is not a marketing pitch for me because I don't own or have anything to do with Yellow Brick, but it's a product that I personally would never leave without. I was very surprised when we did the ARC across the Atlantic to the Caribbean. ARC used the Yellow Brick trackers to track all the boats and put them on the website so everyone can see where all the boats are. I had the Yellow Brick tracker long before that. We've had them in every Volvo ocean race on every single boat. And you could buy this after the ARC race for a very low cost. And very few people bought them. And I was very surprised. And I thought, wow, why do people not buy these things? Because to me, this is an incredible piece of technology. Basically, it's a small little unit. It can transmit your position up to every 15 minutes, even more frequent. It has an amazing battery life. Just to give you an idea, I mean, if you transmit twice a day, it can transmit positions on one charge for 9 months. If it transmits every 15 minutes, it can transmit for non-stop for 3 weeks. You can use it to have two-way communication, and you can connect it to phone. You can connect it to MRCC. For me, it's the best safety device I can imagine, and I'll explain why. Because when you jump in a life raft, if something really goes wrong, you jump into life raft, you can bring with you an EPIRB, you can bring with you an VHF. The VHF only works for someone who's in really close proximity to your life raft. And the EPIRB only is a one-way communication. The EPIRB only tells someone on land that this EPIRB has been activated. It doesn't even tell if the EPIRB is alone, floating in the ocean, or if the EPIRB is with people, or what's the status. Having this little device that can connect to anyone and anything with a two-way communication with an enormous battery life means, first of all, a lot of people are going to know where you are all the time, and you're going to communicate with them. You can send messages, you can receive messages. So for me, I always advise offshore sailors who wants to go across the ocean, bring one of these with you. I would never go without. It's the one thing I would never leave without if anyone asked me. So that's a little bit of a sale trick. I have nothing to do with them commercially. I like to say that. I think it costs £400, 300 something pounds. On top of it, you only pay when you use it. So you don't pay for a subscription. It's only credits. So you pay per time it's used. And it's a very low investment. And they give you a website so your friends and family can follow the boat. So there are some other products that are similar, but I've been very successful with this. And then I like to say, two things. If you have the opportunity to jump in the life raft before you go cruising, I did that. I did that with our family in the Volvo ocean race. We do it all the time. We practice getting into the life rafts, getting all the people into it, making sure the life raft doesn't drift away. Super strong confidence builder, and the same with man overboard training to do that in warm waters. Actually have someone jumping in the water, preferably when you are close to land, so someone can swim in if you don't manage. It's just a very strong confidence builder, and for guests, it's a fantastic experience to enjoy it. My final slide, so I have time for some questions, is really, it's just, my biggest philosophy in life has to be the word to be in the same boat. I think to me, being in the same boat, it really means being locked together. And many people who ask when we sail these long offshore races, when you are together for 9 months on the boat and you're up to 35 days in a row, and it smells bad, the food is terrible compared to a cruising boat, there's no proper beds or bunks, but you really work extremely well with other people in all those situations. There's never arguments, really. There's never big fights, very, very few, because you're really stuck together, so you're going to be with all these people to the end. And the lives we live today, we have this choice to leave people when we don't want to work with them anymore, but in the boat you can't. And that philosophy, whether it's cruising or racing, is one of my biggest reasons for going sailing, is this opportunity to be stuck with other people and having to work together and having to live together and share together all these experiences uninterrupted. And there's never a question whether people leave or not, because at least to the next harbor, they are on board, and you have this amazing bond together by being out in the water. So that was really all I had. So thank you for listening. And I see that there's quite a few questions here. I see there is some questions to me.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Knut. Obviously, you have some questions given by our attendees. We thank them for that.
Yes.
One of these questions is quite direct.
Yeah.
Would you be able to share the report you have been mentioning about the use of electronics. Maybe it's a confidential report.
Yeah, no, I can share some of it. I can share some of it with you, Pierre, and then we can take some content.
Okay.
Some of it is very, very technical, so it's a bit boring.
Yeah. Okay. What I can propose is to Spike Bornius is to give me an email, and I will make
absolutely.
The link with you. Okay, thank you.
I see there's a question about there's another question here about self-docking sailing yachts.
Yeah.
And self-docking sailing yachts, it's still quite far away. I tell you why, and I tell you the reason. So one is cost, right? And that is that today in a car, most new cars you buy today, they have docking assistance or parking assistance, which means there is a sensor, a small short-range radar that tells you the distance to the wall, and it beeps. And a lot of cars have cameras as well. Typically, if you want to add that to a car today, you maybe pay, 500 euros extra or 800 euros extra. The first edition of these camera systems for boats, we are talking about $15,000. I mean, it's very expensive systems. So for me, I think that until we get the cost level of those systems, so it's more similar to what you pay as an add-on to a car, very few are going to do it because it's limited how it can work. So self-docking, I think, is very far away, but docking assistance is also a little bit further away. And the other reason is that the perfect boat to do self-docking, we have a couple of prototypes in our company that is actually self-docking today, and that have all these cameras that gives you a very good overview of the area around the boat. The perfect boat is to take a 30-foot motorboat with a center console and a roof, and you can place cameras around the roof. In a sailboat, first of all, you have the mast. Then typically you have a dinghy hanging behind on a passerelle or something. You have a coach roof or some canvas in the back over the cockpit. So suddenly you have to start putting many more cameras to get that 360 view around the boat, and then it becomes more expensive again and more complex. And also sailing boats is far more impacted by drift. They're impacted because they have more windage typically. And maneuvering a sailboat, it kind of needs the speed to maneuver. To have a Tesla parking is quite easy because the Tesla can stop and it can just reassess the situation. But sometimes when you dock your boat, you simply cannot stop. You need to have speed. So I still think sailing and auto docking is quite far away, but I think some assistance in the docking is going to come fairly soon with giving you the distance to the dock if you can't see that, and which is, for example, in a catamaran, very useful when it's so wide.
Okay.
Right.
Another question from Magnus. It's about the risk management due to the risk of lightning, for example, on the digital and electronic materials. What about this? Shortly.
Well, yeah, that's a very good question. I've sailed through a lot of lightning in my life, and I've had some accidents when typically the wind instrument in the top has been damaged. I would say if you are going to sail a lot in the Caribbean, for example, where there's quite a lot of lightning at night, I would probably bring a spare wind sensor with me in the boat. That's the first thing, because it's very difficult to disconnect completely the wind sensor from the boat in the case of lightning. It sits up there in the top of the mast. You don't want to climb in the top of the mast during lightning either, but you can make sure there is earthing, obviously, from the rig, and that helps to some extent. But then I would say that it is possible to have switches so you can switch off the connectivity to some of your systems in case of lightning. So if you sail through a really bad storm, you can decide to switch it off. But I know for some reason I have sailed through a lot and I've never really damaged heavily my electronics. I've had a couple of wind sensors that's been damaged, but I've never had more. So it's also about trying to avoid the weather. And I would say to use radar. The modern radars today, you can actually track weather really, really well on the radar, and try to understand which direction and course a really bad cloud is moving, and try to go around it, and particularly end up behind the cloud, not try to escape in front, but try to get behind. It is very useful tactics in areas where there's a lot of lightning.
Okay.
Let me see here. There is some other questions. Let me see.
On the Q&A only session on the right, maybe you have them.
Ah, there. Sorry, yes, there's more here.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. What would a good source be for weather fronts, as on the left of your slide? Weather fronts. Yeah. I think the three sources I listed are very good sources to get grid files. So have a grid file on the boat is for me very useful. The reason I say that is that I typically don't want to have internet on the boat all the time. Sometimes I connect if I have a Iridium or something on board that I can connect with. So then you want to have a weather model on the computer or on your chart plotter that you can click forward and click backwards just to see what happens. Always know that the weather model is not 100% correct. So I would always have a grid file with me. On the fronts, I use radar to track fronts, and I use the barometer to see where we are compared to weather fronts. But that's how I really do it. How do you manage risk when more digital, since it's more sensitive, for instance, to electric spikes, including lightning? Yeah, that was the lightning question, right? Yeah, bigger screens, but they are still in landscape mode rather than vertical to see where you are going. Why? Very good question, and I think that is about to change. It has annoyed me a lot because in one way, I think it is because navigation originally was kind of more influenced by commercial shipping, which are fairly slow, and they really want to see the big view. They want to see to the side. There are some reasons to see things horizontally or vertically because you can see longer, right? You can see further distance. I personally like both, actually. And today we have just launched a new screen that can do both. You can tip it 90 degrees and then it changes the picture. But I think you will see that coming. And the other big benefit with having rectangular screens that can be moved 90 degrees is that it gives you many more good mounting options on a sailboat. Many more good mounting options on the sailboat. So that was a very good question. Okay. Let me see here.
Question from Raimundo, maybe, about digital switchboard.
Yes. Digital switching. Yes, I think today we are getting to a place where digital switching is starting to work really well. So I'm very comfortable about it today. But you will see that the best brands in digital switching, they actually have a manual override as well. So if you are really worried about, losing all the power on the boat and having electric problems, there is a manual override that you can do. So there's kind of you can almost think about it. There is a manual fuse underneath, but you can manually go there and actually switch things on and off, but you can also control it. And I think the fact that you can control it from the screens, for me, it's very useful in the cruising context because you remember to do things right. You don't have to go downstairs to switch on the nav lights. There are many small bits and pieces. It just simplifies the journey. But I think today digital switching is really reliable. That's my view. Okay. There's one here about polars. Far from all cruising boat producers have polars for fully loaded boats to share. Very good point. Any tips for this besides having to record your own? It's difficult. The load thing is a massive thing that people underestimate, and typically the designers want to show you a very impressive polars, so they show you for the perfect boat that has very little in the fuel tanks and is fairly empty, and then you put all the stuff you need to go across the Atlantic, and then the speed changed significantly. You can find polars online today for quite a few boats. So one thing first, if you don't have it for your boat and your boat brand don't provide it, try to find a similar boat. That's a good start, and there are many similar boats out there. And then I would take some reference points and see if the polars are wrong and right. If you have about 100 reference points with different wind speeds and wind angles, you can say that there is some percentage here that the boat is always slower, always faster. Then you can add that or take it away. So you have to do some manual calibration, unfortunately, of that. It's very hard to get around it. So I would spend a little bit of time on that. It's really worth and it's interesting to learn.
Okay, just a little point. You mentioned many different topics, including safety, including boat management, including electronics, including maybe medicine also. Just I wanted to say, and I mentioned it in the chat, that Grand Large has a part in a company called Escale Formation Technique that delivers very high-level learning sessions mainly in French, but some of them are in English. Due to that, all these questions. So feel free to ask for escaleformationtechnique.com, and this is the website. The last point I wanted to say is we had I had a private chat by Bernard. I will just read it, and this gives the good and the real reason why we have been driving these webinars. Bernard says, we just started sailing and are still in the evaluation phase, which yacht will be about. Target is to go sailing for months and months. So today I got some good input again. So giving that kind of input is just what we wanted to do with that webinars. And I think today you have given a strong input by yourself, Knut, and we wanted to thank you very much for that.
No, thank you, Björn, and thank you to everyone listening. And I hope to meet many of you on the water, and that you all enjoy years to come on the water. Thank you.
Okay. Just a few seconds again. The Grand Large Yachting Group has been running for the first time a Grand Large Yachting World Odyssey with more than 30 boats that have been leaving the Canaries a few days ago. So this boat will be running around the world as a fleet for the next 3 years. And we invite you to follow this Odyssey on the dedicated website and also on our brand websites. That was the point. And this once said, we thank you again for being present in that Blue Water Sailing webinars. This was the last session. This was one of the most interesting one, I guess. Thank you again, Knut. And I have to just to mention that we have some very VIP attendees today. For example, Mr. Jimmy Cornell was among us, and we give you a salute, Jimmy. Okay. See you all. Thanks again.
See you all. Thank you very much.
Thank you.